Let us begin our sermon. We all know how the storyline unfolds in the movies. The lead character, a person who has taken on a public role in a small community, witnesses injustice and begins to make changes that ruffle the town's feathers. That person, in their drive to eliminate injustice, faces persecution as the community bristles against the very thought that what they have been doing was wrong. The ones that benefit from the injustice are comfortable at how they are living and don't see why there is a requirement to change. When this lead character arrives, their actions begin to reveal what really is happening. Their actions begin to reveal that something is not right. And when they make any changes, they begin to receive at best ridicule. And at worst, we see violence escalate. Change begins to happen, but along with it comes hate, divisiveness, and violence. Any one of us could name a dozen such movies. We know how the story goes, and yet when we are confronted with difficult truths in our own lives, truths that call us to something different, we get defensive and build walls rather than hear the truth that is being spoken. Why is it so difficult to hear hard truths? Why is our first reaction to hold tightly to our preconceived notions about ourselves and our world than it is to listen and hear? Why do we long to hold on to what we thought we knew rather than to adapt because of new information that shows us we were running in the wrong direction? Why are we more comfortable with believing things that make it more palatable for us than we are to hear stories from others that might mean we have to change how we live our lives according to the way of God, the way of loving our neighbor? Peter thought he knew how following the Messiah would go. One moment he found himself getting it right when he declared Jesus was the Messiah. And moments later, the one he named as Messiah was calling him out as evil because his preconceived notions about what was a Messiah was standing in the way of hearing a hard truth. The truth that loving God and loving neighbors leads to suffering and death. Reverend T. Denise Anderson reflects on this exact conundrum. She says, I'm a Black woman who does anti-racism education and advocacy in a very white denomination. I do that work often in the face of fierce opposition from fellow Christians, but it's not hard to understand why. Think of the times we've tried to quiet a friend who was going through a tough time, or averted our eyes away from someone asking for money on a street corner. Approximately 75% of sexual assaults in the US go unreported for a reason. We don't exactly incentivize the telling of hard truths. Hard truths trouble the waters of our understanding and challenge notions of what is real. For Peter, hearing Jesus foretell his agonizing death and resurrection must have made no sense. Just before this, he had named Jesus Messiah. How could the Christ talk like this? Peter wants to quiet Jesus. Jesus would instead quiet him. At Jesus' transfiguration, a sight that may have been more in line with Peter's messianic imagination, he wants to build altars to mark the event. But again, Peter is quieted. He is told to listen. So I ask, What hard truths are we having a hard time hearing as the people of God in Estevan, Saskatchewan and Lantman, Saskatchewan? What hard truth is being revealed that demands us to pick up our cross and follow Christ? What hard truth brings up our defenses and makes us want to rebuke the voices speaking God's call? God's call to lose our comfortable lives and preconceived notions in order that we might love God and love our neighbor. What things are we being asked to give up for the sake of justice? What is the good news demanding of us in terms of repentance? What voices bring up our defenses and should be the ones that we listen to? Do we need to hear the voices of those who say our earth is groaning from the weight of our actions? Do we need to listen to the scientists that declare that climate change is real and that our actions are contributing to it? Or is it the voices of those who say that we need to rethink the cultural norms that we live by and many of us profit by? Do we need to listen to the voices of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, not blaming them for their actions, but really listening to hear their stories without judgment? Do we need to hear the stories that remind us that Black lives really do matter? Standing at the concentration camp and crematorium at Auschwitz, in his popular 1970s program, The Ascent of Man, Dr. Jacob Bronowski, himself a descendant of people who were killed in Auschwitz, said, "This is where people were turned into numbers. Into this pond were flushed the ashes of some 4 million people. And that was not done by gas. It was done by arrogance. It was done by dogma. It was done by ignorance. When people believe they have absolute knowledge with no test in reality, this is how they behave." We all, me included, this week has been a bad week for being defensive. We need to live with a sense of our fallibility, to live with the limitation of our own certainty, and to recognize that those voices that challenge us, that bring up our defensiveness, just might be the voice of God calling us to repentance, calling us to turn back to God. And as Oliver Cromwell wrote in a letter about a conflict he was having with the church in Scotland, wrote, "I beseech you, in the bowels of Christ, think it possible. You may be mistaken. Think it possible. You may be mistaken." Again and again, we are called to turn back to the ways of God who meets us where we are. Again and again, we are called to dig deep into that love that names us beloved and begin to listen to difficult things that bring up our defenses, because it is there that the voice of God is at work. Again and again, we are called to find God's hope that not even death, the death of all that we hold near and dear, can keep us from the love of God. Again and again, God meets us in our defenses and calls us into the way of the cross that might look like the end of everything we've ever known, but in God's kingdom becomes a beginning that leads to the way of resurrection and new life, where love and justice prevail. Thanks be to God.